Watch what happens the next time retirement comes up at a family gathering. Somebody mentions it, maybe a brother who just hit 60, maybe a coworker who suddenly won't stop talking about their 401k, and the whole room tightens up a little. Everyone goes quiet, and if you look around, you'll notice something. Nobody at that table is actually sure they're going to be okay. They just don't want to be the first one to say it out loud. That feeling doesn't go away on its own. For a lot of people, it follows them for years, sometimes for the rest of their working life. I'm Mark and welcome to Mark Invest. I spend a borderline unhealthy amount of time thinking about money, not in a check-the-spreadsheet at 6 a.m. way, but in a way that keeps circling one question. Why do some people walk into retirement calm and steady, while others, with roughly the same bank balance, spend those exact same years anxious and second-guessing every move? I've chased that question for a long time, and the deeper I go, the clearer one thing becomes. The answer almost never comes down to who saved the most. It's something else. It's a handful of habits, a few decisions, and frankly some particular ways of thinking about the future that quietly separate the people who feel secure from the people who technically have money but still lie awake worried. So today I want to walk through 6 signs, not promises, not a checklist to tick off. Just real signals that you might already be further ahead than the overwhelming majority of people heading toward retirement. And I don't mean a nudge ahead. I mean the kind of lead that, 20 years from now, completely changes how your life actually feels day to day. Some of these might catch you off guard, some might make you feel good about choices you've already made, and 1 or 2 might sting. If they do good, that's worth paying attention to. Let's get into it. Sign 1, you actually know your number. Most people carry around a fuzzy sense that retirement requires a lot of money. They've latched onto some figure, $1 million, $2 million, $5 million, usually something they heard on TV or picked up from a coworker who skimmed a headline. And they've anchored to that number without ever running the math on their own life. That isn't a plan, that's a hope with a price tag attached. But if you've sat down on your own or with somebody who knows what they're doing, and worked out a realistic income number for your lifestyle, your expenses, your expectations around healthcare and travel, and what you actually want your days to look like, you're already in a small club. Most people never do it, not because they're lazy, because it's uncomfortable. Running those numbers forces you to look reality in the eye, and reality occasionally has sharp edges. Here's the part people miss, though. Knowing your number, even if the number scares you a little, is one of the most grounding things you can possibly do. There's a well-known trap in behavioral finance, the idea that we consistently lowball what things will cost and overestimate how smoothly everything's going to go. Retirement is a perfect storm for it, because the future feels abstract while today's bills feel extremely real. So people keep stalling on the math, keep throwing money into their accounts, and keep crossing their fingers. If you've broken out of that loop, if you have a rough sense of what each year in retirement will cost, a withdrawal approach you genuinely understand, and a clear idea of how Social Security fits in, you are already ahead. Not because everything's solved, but because you stared the question down instead of looking away. Most folks won't do that until they're about 5 years out and suddenly realize the runway is shorter than they thought. Sign 2, you've quietly lived below your means for years. Let me be careful with this one because it gets twisted constantly. Living below your means is not about deprivation. It's not skipping the coffee or canceling the vacation. It's that at some point in your working life, you really understood the gap between what comes in and what goes out, and you chose to keep that gap wide on purpose. Not because money was tight, but because you knew exactly what that gap was buying you. And what it buys you is breathing room. Options. The ability to take a hit, a health scare, a layoff, a brutal market year, without it turning into a full-blown disaster. Picture 2 people who both earn $80,000. One built a life that runs on about $60,000. The other slowly let their lifestyle rise to meet every raise, nicer car, bigger house, upgrades on everything, and now spends every dollar that lands, sometimes more. Same job title. From the outside, equally successful. But fast forward 30 years and one of them has 2 decades of savings quietly compounding in the background, while the other is still one missed paycheck away from panic. The people who retire well aren't necessarily the big earners. That's one of the most counterintuitive findings in all of wealth research. Income and net worth are connected far more loosely than you'd expect. What matters way more is your savings rate, held steady over decades. If you've managed to consistently spend less than you make, and this is the real tell if that habit has become so automatic that it doesn't even feel like sacrifice anymore, you're in a genuinely enviable spot. A lot of people never get there at all. Sign 3, you stay put when everyone else panics. This one's subtle, and it's bigger than it looks, partly because the urge to outsmart the market seems to be wired into us. Here's what I mean. Every time things get bumpy, a rate hike, a recession scare, some geopolitical mess, a rough earnings season, a chunk of investors get jumpy and start shuffling things around. They run to cash. They cut their stock exposure. They tell themselves they'll jump back in when the moment feels right. And nearly every piece of data we have on this says the same thing. It costs them. Maybe not this month, but over the long haul, almost always. The reason is simple. The market doesn't wait for you to feel comfortable again. Some of the single biggest up days in market history have landed right on the heels of the scariest, most volatile stretches. If you're parked in cash when those rebounds hit, you miss them. And missing just a small handful of the market's best days over a couple of decades can slice your total returns roughly in half. That's not a rounding error. That's a different retirement entirely. So if you've reached the point where you've got a simple, diversified setup, a 3-fund portfolio, a target date fund, whatever it is, and you've genuinely stopped fiddling with it every time the news cycle spikes your blood pressure, you're doing something most individual investors wrestle with their whole lives. The discipline to ride out a 30% drop without bailing is rarer than people assume. Plenty of investors have never lived through a real bear market with real money on the line, and when they finally do, a lot of them flinch. If you've sat through a few downturns and held your ground, maybe even bought more on the way down, you've learned something about yourself you can't learn any other way. You know you can take it. That's worth a lot. Sign 4, you have an actual plan for healthcare. Healthcare might be the single biggest wildcard in this whole equation. It's also the thing people dodge for as long as humanly possible, which makes sense, because it's genuinely complicated and a little scary once you let the numbers sink in. Here's a figure that gets passed around, and it should. A couple retiring at 65 today can expect to spend somewhere around $300,000 on healthcare across their retirement, and that's after Medicare. Out-of-pocket costs, the dental work Medicare barely acknowledges, vision, hearing aids, long-term care if it comes to that. These numbers are real, and they're big enough to matter. None of this is fun to think about, but even if you've only done some of this planning, you're already ahead of the crowd whose entire strategy is Medicare's got it. Which, to be blunt, isn't a strategy. Medicare matters, it helps enormously, but it doesn't cover everything, and the gaps are wide enough to do real damage. And one more layer here. People who take their health seriously in the years before retirement are quietly setting themselves up financially, too. It sounds obvious, but it's easy to skip past. Regular movement, decent sleep, staying on top of chronic conditions early. Those aren't just feel-good lifestyle choices, they're financial ones. Staying healthier longer genuinely cuts what you'll spend on care, and it adds years where you actually get to enjoy everything you built. Sign 5, your identity isn't glued to your job. This one has nothing to do with money, and that's exactly why it might matter most. Retirement researchers have documented this pattern again and again, and it's honestly one of the sadder things in the literature. People who spent 30 or 40 years with an identity wrapped tightly around their professional role, the title, the company, the expertise, the feeling of being needed, often hit a wall in the first couple of years after they stop. Not financially, emotionally, existentially, the money's there, they just don't recognize who they are anymore. I think about a guy, let's call him Richard, 37 years in corporate finance, wildly successful by any measure you'd care to name. He planned, he saved, he retired at 64 with more than enough to coast comfortably for the rest of his life. 6 months in, he told his wife he wanted to go back to work, not for the paycheck, because he felt invisible. Strip away the meetings and the title and the problems to solve, and he had no idea what to do with himself. That story isn't rare. It shows up often enough that researchers have a name for it, a retirement identity crisis, and it leaks out in all sorts of ways. Low mood, tension at home, impulsive money decisions, compulsively refreshing the market just because at least that feels like having something to manage. But if you've built a life where your sense of meaning is spread across a bunch of things, relationships, hobbies, your community, creative stuff, faith. Whatever it is for you, your experience of retirement is going to look completely different from someone arriving with a single source of purpose that's about to evaporate. This isn't really about having a hobby. It's about having a self that isn't fully defined by what you produce at work. If you can honestly say there are people and pursuits in your life, outside the job, that means something to you, you're in better shape than you might give yourself credit for. A lot of people can't say that. Sign 6. You understand sequence of returns risk. Last one's a touch more technical, but stay with me, because it's one of the most important ideas in all of retirement planning, and the simple fact that you've even heard of it already puts you ahead of most. Here's the core of it. While you're still working and stacking up savings, a bad market year stings on paper but doesn't really wound you. You keep contributing, you're buying at lower prices, and eventually it recovers. But the moment you flip into retirement and start drawing out of your portfolio, the timing of those bad years suddenly carries enormous weight. A serious downturn in the first few years of retirement, when your balance is at its peak, and you're actively withdrawing, can permanently dent your long-term wealth in a way the exact same drop 10 years later simply wouldn't. That sequence of returns risk, and it's why just stay the course, which is basically right while you're accumulating, gets more nuanced once you're retired. The order of the returns matters. A rough first decade followed by a great one is a wildly different retirement than a great decade followed by a rough one, even if the average return across the whole stretch is identical. People who get this tend to have already started thinking about how to soften it. Maybe they're keeping a cash or short-term bond buffer, sometimes called a cash bucket, so they're never forced to sell stocks into a down market just to cover the bills. Maybe they're planning to spend flexibly, easing off the discretionary stuff in a bad year, instead of withdrawing the same amount no matter what. Maybe they've timed Social Security to lock in more guaranteed income and lean less on the portfolio in those fragile early years. There's no single right answer here, but the people who are even thinking about it, who have a rough game plan for what they'll do if year 2 of retirement greets them with an ugly market, are going to come out dramatically better than the folks planning to pull 4% a year and just see how it shakes out. That's not a plan, that's the starting line for one. Close. So let's loop back to where we started, that dinner table, that uneasy little silence when retirement comes up. The reason it happens is that most people are living inside a fog of uncertainty they've never really tried to clear. They don't know their number. They're still reacting emotionally to every market wobble. They're banking on Medicare to handle health care. Their whole sense of self is tied to a job that's going to end. And they've never even heard of sequence of returns risk, let alone thought about how to handle it. But you watched this all the way through, which tells me you're probably not that person. People who seek out content like this are, almost by definition, the ones already trying to think it through. That's not a small thing. It's actually a lot. Being ahead in retirement was never about being the richest person in the room. It's about clarity, knowing what you have, knowing what you need, and knowing what you'll do when things don't go to plan. It's about building a life full enough of meaning that retirement becomes something you walk toward on purpose, instead of something that just happens to you. If some of these signs landed for you today, great. Feel good about that, genuinely. And if a couple of them stung, take it as information, not a final verdict. The fact that you noticed means there's still runway to do something about it. That's the real payoff of paying attention now, before the stakes feel as heavy as they eventually will. The people who retire well were never the ones who had it all figured out from day one. They were the ones who kept asking better questions, so keep asking. If this was useful and you want to go deeper, come join the community, links in the description. Give the video a like, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Mark Invest so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.